What if the Berlin Wall had never fallen? The night of November 9th, 1989, was supposed to mark the dawn of a new era. In our reality, thousands of East Berliners flooded through the checkpoints, danced atop the Berlin Wall, and embraced their long-lost brothers and sisters from the West. Hammers chipped at the concrete. Hope surged through the streets. History cracked wide open. But what if the wall didn't fall? Imagine this instead. At 7 p.m., as East Berliners gather around their televisions to hear Günter Schabowski's fateful press conference, the words that altered the world are never uttered. There is no effective immediately, no misunderstanding, no accidental opening of the border. The party line is clear. Reforms will be gradual, carefully managed, and the wall, the anti-fascist protection barrier, will remain. Tension simmers as hopeful East Berliners mill near the Bornholmer Strasse crossing, waiting, expecting, believing. But then, instead of the gates opening, they are met with cold silence and the snap of Kalashnikovs being raised. Warnings are shouted. A line is drawn in concrete and blood. In the crowd, a 23-year-old engineering student named Lucas Meyer clutches a hand-painted sign. Wir sind das Volk. We are the people. Next to him, his younger sister Jana trembles. She had hoped tonight would be the night she crossed into the West for good. Instead, a flare lights the sky. A scream follows. The Volkspolizei moves in. Batons rise. The crowd scatters. By midnight, East Berlin looks less like a revolution and more like a prison lockdown. The wall still stands, not as a relic, but as a renewed symbol of defiance. The uprising is crushed before it can begin. Behind the scenes, hardliners in the Socialist Unity Party, SED, panic at the sudden momentum for reunification. Erich Honecker had resigned weeks earlier, but in this timeline, Egon Krenz lacks the spine to let change happen. Instead of yielding, he doubles down. He calls Moscow, but this is not the Moscow of Stalin, nor even of Brezhnev. It is the hesitant, reformist Kremlin of Mikhail Gorbachev. We cannot sustain the empire by force, he had privately told his advisors. Yet here he is, awakened at 2 a.m. by a secure line from East Berlin, hearing desperate voices beg for military support. East Germany is unraveling, they say. The West is circling like vultures. If the wall falls, so might the whole Warsaw Pact. Gorbachev hesitates. The Soviet economy is on life support. The war in Afghanistan has bled them dry, but his own grasp on power is weakening. The Politburo whispers of betrayal, of weakness, of perestroika leading to collapse. And so, against his better judgment, Gorbachev authorizes a limited deployment of Soviet peacekeepers into East Germany, not to conquer, but to contain. By dawn on November 10th, Soviet tanks roll once again through the streets of Dresden, Leipzig, and Berlin. The West is stunned. Washington scrambles. Bonn burns with rage. British tabloids scream, "The Red Wall rises again." And across the divide, Chancellor Helmut Kohl is left staring at a geopolitical nightmare. The chance for reunification, so close he could taste it, has slipped through his fingers. Back in East Berlin, the propaganda machine revs to life. The SED declares the protests to be CIA-orchestrated plots. They announce new economic revitalization efforts, but citizens know better. The Stasi begins mass arrests. Dissidents vanish into the cold silence of Hohenschönhausen. Lucas Meyer is one of them, and yet, a spark had already been lit. While the world watches nervously, something darker brews beneath the iron surface. An East German resistance, more organized and determined than ever, begins to rise from the ashes of broken dreams. But one decision would change everything. The first snow of December 1989 settled like a hush over Berlin, not a symbol of peace, but a cover for fear. The city remained cleaved by concrete and ideology. In the east, the streets were quieter than ever, but it was not tranquility. It was surveillance. Inside the austere offices of the Stasi headquarters in Lichtenberg, General Marcus Wolf reviewed dossiers by dim lamplight. Once the elusive man without a face, Wolf had resigned in our timeline, sensing the inevitable tide. But in this world, he stayed, recalled by the hardliners to stabilize the regime's crumbling grasp. His mission? Root out subversion before it becomes revolution. The mass protests that had roiled Leipzig and Dresden had been dismantled with brutal efficiency. Thousands arrested, hundreds disappeared. Broadcasts across state media painted the West as aggressors, infiltrators, and economic imperialists. But behind the iron facade, even SED officials whispered doubts. The DDR was bankrupt, both financially and spiritually. Still, Moscow stood by them. Gorbachev's gamble to support the East German government was not popular in the Kremlin, but it was seen as necessary. The Soviet 8th Guards Army, positioned outside Magdeburg, ran joint drills with the Nationale Volksarmee, NVA. Soviet advisors began quietly replacing DDR officers considered unreliable. The message was clear: the wall will not fall, the East will hold. But it came at a price. Western sanctions were swift and severe. The U.S., under President George H.W. Bush, froze diplomatic normalization talks with the USSR. NATO conducted emergency exercises in West Germany, France, and the Low Countries. Operation Iron Signal, a show of strength designed to deter further Soviet entrenchment. For ordinary citizens in East Germany, life became harder. The winter was cruel. Heating oil was rationed. Store shelves once sparse were now bare. The currency was collapsing. The black market thrived. Western music, blue jeans, and bootleg VHS tapes passed through hidden channels. Symbols of rebellion. Symbols of the world that still existed just meters away, across a concrete border laced with death strips and floodlights. In a cramped apartment in Prenzlauer Berg, Lucas Meyer's absence was a cold, unspoken truth. His sister Jana, now 19, assumed the worst. But she didn't cry. She wrote. On a battered typewriter she had inherited from their grandfather, Jana began drafting manifestos, leaflets, essays, smuggled through underground networks revived from the ruins of the earlier protest movement. She found others like her, teachers, students, priests. They called themselves Feuerlinie, the fire line. Jana wasn't alone. Across the country, the regime's cruelty had birthed its own resistance. In Leipzig, church leaders revived their sanctuary role. In Jena, young factory workers formed sabotage cells. And in Dresden, a former NVA officer named Karl Brenner began organizing a militant wing of the resistance, trained in asymmetric tactics and committed to armed defiance if necessary. The Stasi noticed. Arrests grew. But with every crackdown, the underground grew more careful, more sophisticated. Radio Free Europe began receiving anonymous messages from inside East Germany, detailing troop movements, documenting disappearances, and appealing to the outside world not to forget them. And outside, the world was watching, with increasing discomfort. Chancellor Helmut Kohl was under immense pressure. The German public, who had seen the dream of reunification within reach, now demanded clarity. Was the wall permanent? Would Bonn recognize East Berlin's sovereignty once more? Kohl refused. In fiery speeches, he declared that Germany was one nation, illegally divided. But behind closed doors, he negotiated desperately with Washington, London, and Paris to keep the Cold War from reigniting into something far hotter. In Washington, voices within the Pentagon and the CIA began floating a once taboo idea: covert support for the East German resistance. The memories of Hungary, 1956, and Prague, 1968, loomed large. Western inaction had led to brutal Soviet crackdowns. But the risk of escalation now was no less daunting. Bush was cautious. "We will not start World War III over Berlin," he said in a closed NSC meeting. But in that same meeting, he authorized a CIA working group to begin low-level support operations. Information, smuggling routes, communications gear. Nothing lethal, not yet. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union bled silently. Gorbachev's half-measures had pleased no one. Reformers saw him as a coward, hardliners as a traitor, riots broke out in the Baltic states. Georgia boiled with ethnic tension. In Poland, solidarity re-emerged stronger, angrier. The Red Winter had begun, not of frost, but of crumbling certainties. And in East Berlin, on a quiet street corner on January 15, 1990, a leaflet fluttered in the wind. It read, "We are still here, we are still many, and we will not be silent." The wall still stood, but so did the people. What came after was even more unexpected. February 7th, 1980. A bitter Tuesday in the gray industrial corridors of East Germany. In Leipzig, the heart of the peaceful protests that had once offered hope, something irreversible snapped. That morning, workers at the Kombinat VEB Maschinenbau, a state-run engineering factory, were told their bonuses had been canceled, citing resource reallocation for state defense. The factory was already underproducing, and the shelves in workers' homes were already bare. That announcement, dropped like a hammer, ignited more than economic frustration. It stirred humiliation, anger. By noon, thousands of workers flooded Karl Marx Platz, chanting slogans the regime had outlawed. Freiheit, Einheit, keine Angst. Freedom, unity, no fear. This time, they were not holding candles. They held bricks, tools, even stolen batons. A line of riot police stood waiting. For a moment, the two forces faced off, one side armored in black, the other armored in desperation. Then a shot rang out. The police claimed later that it was an accident, a pistol discharged too early. But the crowd had heard enough promises, enough lies. Rage erupted. The line shattered. The police were overwhelmed. Officers were beaten. A personnel carrier was set ablaze. Government buildings were stormed. The People's Chamber Regional Office was seized, its contents hurled into the streets. By 4 p.m., Leipzig was no longer under SED control. State television cut to emergency broadcasts. The city had become a hotbed of counter-revolutionary terror. In reality, it was a spontaneous uprising, leaderless but potent. For 19 hours, Leipzig belonged to the people. And then the tanks came. Soviet T-72s rolled into the city from the west. NVA units, under the command of General Horst Steckbarth, reimposed martial law. The resistance was crushed with ruthless speed. Over 300 civilians were killed, thousands arrested. The West would learn of the massacre days later, through smuggled Polaroids and a tear-streaked report dictated by a former Lutheran pastor hiding in a church cellar. International outrage was immediate, but so was confusion. The Soviet Union claimed it had no role, that the crackdown was a sovereign East German response. Gorbachev appeared on Soviet television, somber and evasive. "Reform," he said, "must not become anarchy." But it was clear. The USSR had sanctioned the bloodshed. NATO convened an emergency summit in Brussels. President Bush, Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, Chancellor Kohl, and President François Mitterrand sat around a table more tense than at any point since the Cuban Missile Crisis. The intelligence was damning. Soviet armored divisions were reinforcing their positions in the GDR. Troop movements in Czechoslovakia and Hungary indicated a general mobilization. Some feared it was the beginning of a rollback, a new Brezhnev doctrine under a different name. Yet cooler heads prevailed. Barely. Thatcher warned against overreaction. Mitterrand demanded diplomacy. But Bush held firm. NATO would not accept Soviet military expansion beyond its current lines. Any movement into West Germany or Austria would be seen as a red line. Behind closed doors, American planners began activating Operation Sundial, a contingency plan to reinforce NATO's forward positions with rapid deployment forces from the US, Britain, and France. While the superpowers maneuvered, the Eastern Bloc itself began to fracture. Poland erupted in protests after the Leipzig massacre. In Gdańsk, Lech Wałęsa appeared before a crowd of 200,000 and declared that the age of Soviet dominion was over. "We see now that their promises are as false as their socialism," he shouted. The crowd roared. In Hungary, reformist Prime Minister Miklos Nemeth publicly criticized East Germany's barbarism and opened secret talks with Austria about reopening the border, a move that would allow East German dissidents to flee once again, as they had months earlier. But the DDR's border guards had been ordered to shoot to kill this time. Refugee corridors became kill zones. Inside East Germany, repression deepened. The SED established a special tribunal system to try terrorists. These courts operated in secrecy, without legal representation. Lucas Meyer, held in solitary confinement for weeks, was brought before one of these tribunals. His crime? Subversive agitation and incitement to rebellion. Sentence: 15 years in Bautzen II prison. A hellscape of forced labor and psychological torture. Jana, learning of his fate through whispers in the resistance network, refused to be paralyzed. The fire line shifted its strategy. Leaflets and graffiti gave way to sabotage and infiltration. They smuggled foreign press reports back into the country, hacked into state broadcasts, and mapped out state buildings for potential future operations. They knew now that this was no longer about peaceful reunification. It was war, silent, cold, and fought in shadows. Meanwhile, within the KGB, rumblings grew. Gorbachev's decision to deploy troops and sanction repression was not sitting well with the reformist elements in his own intelligence apparatus. A silent mutiny began to brew. Men like Vadim Bakatin, appointed to reform the KGB, began leaking internal communications to foreign intelligence, not for ideology, but to prevent catastrophe. The Cold War, once thought to be fading, was back, colder and more unpredictable than ever, and that was only the beginning of the storm. Spring 1990 arrived in name only. Across Eastern Europe, it felt like the longest winter had never ended, not because of weather, but because of fear. In East Germany, the Leipzig massacre had triggered more than terror. It had triggered clarity. The illusions were gone. Any hope that peaceful reform would be permitted vanished alongside the protesters crushed beneath tank treads. The question now wasn't if there would be revolution, but how soon and how bloody. At the center of it all stood Egon Krenz, a man who had once imagined himself as the reformist heir to Honecker. But he had become something darker, a puppet of both Gorbachev's Kremlin and the crumbling SED Politburo. Each morning he was handed new intelligence reports, each more dire than the last. Dissent was spreading, and the military was losing morale, yet the regime still had tools. Information, after all, was power. In March, the SED launched Operation Yule, a coordinated media assault across state newspapers, radio, and television. They portrayed West Germany as chaotic, crime-ridden, dominated by capitalist exploitation. In contrast, East German propaganda showed happy factory workers, blooming schools, and loyal soldiers defending socialist democracy. But truth seeped in. Western radio frequencies, long jammed, were suddenly audible again. A sign that even the Stasi couldn't keep up. From hidden rooms in Dresden and Jena, young engineers amplified these signals, using scavenged Soviet hardware to turn factory machines into relay antennas. The BBC, Radio Free Europe, even Voice of America flooded the airwaves with one message: you are not alone. Within the fireline resistance, Jana Meyer was now a central figure. Her words, once typed in secret, now echoed from radios in attic rooms and train stations. She became a ghost voice of the resistance, known only by her code name, Lena. Her broadcasts included more than slogans. She read out names of the disappeared, described what happened in Leipzig, quoted from banned Western philosophers. Each word was an act of defiance. But East Germany wasn't the only state trembling. In Moscow, Gorbachev faced a problem far greater than Berlin. His reforms, glasnost and perestroika, had stalled. The old guard in the Central Committee whispered of betrayal. Soviet generals complained of overextension. The KGB was split, with reformists leaking secrets while hardliners plotted survival. In April, Lithuania declared independence from the USSR, not as a request, but as a fact. Gorbachev was caught between principle and pressure. The army pushed for intervention. The West threatened total diplomatic rupture. And so Gorbachev hesitated, again. That hesitation made him appear weak. And in politics, perception is everything. By May, Soviet troops in East Germany were no longer seen as stabilizers, but as occupiers. German resentment festered, not just among dissidents, but among the everyday citizens who watched their children grow up under a cloud of hopelessness. A growing number of NVA officers privately sympathized with the resistance. They had joined to serve the people, not a regime of paranoia and fear. And in a forest just outside Erfurt, that sympathy turned into action. A splinter cell of NVA officers, led by Colonel Ansgar Kroll, began secretly aiding the fire line. Maps, equipment, training. They believed the DDR could no longer be saved, but the German people could. They envisioned a coup, not for power, but to open the border and end the occupation. Planning began under codename Valkyrie Zwei. Meanwhile, in Bonn, Chancellor Kohl's government intensified covert operations. With NATO's tacit blessing, a joint intelligence effort began smuggling encrypted radios, money, and safe passage credentials through Hungary and Czechoslovakia into East Germany. Their goal was not insurrection, at least officially, but to keep hope alive. Publicly, the West walked a tightrope. The Leipzig massacre was still fresh. Another confrontation could spark a global crisis. But in private, lines were crossed. CIA and BND agents operated under deep cover in East Berlin, relaying resistance intelligence directly to NATO command. Then, something unexpected happened. In early June 1990, a Soviet helicopter defected. It landed near Fulda, West Germany. The pilot, Major Yuri Babenko, immediately requested asylum and brought with him tapes of intercepted Stasi conversations. One in particular sent shockwaves through Western intelligence, a recording of General Marcus Wolf discussing elimination protocols for suspected NATO sympathizers inside the East German army. The leak revealed a list of names. Among them, Colonel Ansgar Kroll. The clock was ticking. Inside Berlin, the fire line prepared for their most daring act yet, infiltrating the East German Central Broadcast Station to air a live manifesto, one that would name names, show footage from Leipzig, and call for mass defection from the military. A bold move, a dangerous one. But they knew the time for whispers had ended. Meanwhile, Gorbachev, under pressure from hardliners, watching the Baltic states slip away, his popularity in freefall, made a final, fateful choice. He granted the KGB expanded authority to stabilize the Eastern Bloc. This effectively meant one thing. The reformer had given the wolves license to hunt. By mid-June, Soviet security forces began quietly replacing East German intelligence operatives with KGB special advisors. The DDR was no longer a partner. It was a satellite in every sense of the word. And as Soviet command tightened its grip, paranoia spread like poison gas. In this world, the Berlin Wall didn't fall, but cracks were forming, not in the concrete, but in the men who once guarded it. And soon, one of those cracks would explode into fire. July 1st, 90, midnight. In the belly of East Berlin, under the facade of an old bakery long thought abandoned, 15 people gathered in silence. The concrete walls dripped with moisture, and the air smelled of damp paper and sweat. The fire line resistance had reached the edge of its patience and its fear. Jana Meyer stood at the center, eyes fixed on a weathered floor plan spread across the table. The goal was clear: seize control of the state's primary television broadcast facility for precisely 12 minutes. That's all they would need to air the footage smuggled from Leipzig. Footage of the massacre that the government had denied ever happened. Footage the world still hadn't seen. The risk was colossal. The station, Fernsehzentrum Berlin, was guarded day and night by Ministry of State Security Forces and Soviet advisors. But they had an opening, a shift change, a weak perimeter along the Western Wall, and, most importantly, a rogue technician on the inside. Codename Schiller. Their plan wasn't just to embarrass the regime. It was to fracture the illusion that had held the DDR together for decades, that the state was in control, that the people were afraid, and that no one was watching. The operation began at 3:12 a.m. Two teams, one for infiltration, one for defense. The footage was packed into a modified cassette tape rigged to override the broadcast feed. Every second was calculated, every face masked. If they failed, there would be no trial, only the sound of boots and bullets. They succeeded. At 3:17 a.m., all East German television sets, and many in neighboring countries, flickered into static, then a black screen, then a female voice. This is not a broadcast from the state. This is a broadcast from the people. Jana appeared on screen, hooded, masked, but unmistakably calm. Her voice echoed through every apartment, dormitory, and barracks in the country. She named the dead of Leipzig. She named the Soviet units stationed across the country. She called on East German soldiers to lay down their arms, to remember they were not Stasi, not occupiers, but Germans. And then came the footage. Grainy, brutal, undeniable. Protesters being gunned down in Leipzig. Children fleeing tear gas. Soviet tanks rolling over barricades. The screen cut to black. The fireline symbol, a single matchstick surrounded by a ring of fire, burned silently for 3 final seconds. And then, the regular broadcast resumed, as if nothing had happened. But something had. Within minutes, the Ministry of State Security was in chaos. Marcus Wolf, awoken by a direct call from the Kremlin, was livid. Troops stormed the studio, but the resistance had already vanished through sewer tunnels that predated the war. Dozens of arrests followed. Innocent technicians, janitors, even a Soviet liaison who had been on a coffee break. But the damage was done. By dawn, the footage had spread to West Berlin, smuggled by bike across hidden courier lines. Within hours it aired on the BBC, CNN, and ARD. For the first time, the world saw what East Germany had become, and what the Soviets had done to preserve it. The international fallout was immediate and thunderous. President George H.W. Bush condemned the massacre as a barbaric stain on the conscience of modern Europe. France and the UK recalled their ambassadors to Moscow. Sanctions were expanded. Soviet trade collapsed. But more than political pressure, the footage cracked the psychological hold the Eastern Bloc held over its people. In Prague, students marched in silence, holding images from Leipzig. In Vilnius, crowds chanted Jana Meyer's message word for word, as if it were gospel. And in East Germany, something unimaginable happened. A full battalion of NVA soldiers, the 35th Armored Regiment, stationed outside Rostock, refused deployment orders. Their commander, Major Dieter Noll, declared his men servants of the German people, not of the Soviet Empire. They surrendered their weapons to local civilians and invited press from Sweden to document their act. For the first time since 1968, a Warsaw Pact military unit had mutinied. The Kremlin's response was swift, but fractured. Gorbachev was cornered. His advisors begged for calm. The KGB pushed for purge. The military threatened direct occupation of East Germany, bypassing the DDR entirely. The chaos he had tried to prevent by supporting the wall's survival was now far greater than if it had simply fallen. Inside the Kremlin, whispers of removal began. KGB chairman Vladimir Kryuchkov, once a loyal enforcer, began quietly assessing whether Gorbachev could be replaced, and by whom. The name most whispered? Anatoly Lukyanov, a hardliner and party bureaucrat with the backing of the military-industrial elite. Meanwhile, inside East Berlin, the SED held emergency meetings in bunkers. Their fear was no longer foreign subversion, but internal collapse. The Volkskammer was now divided. Half its members favored immediate negotiation with the West. The others, steeled by paranoia and the KGB's presence, demanded a clampdown. The compromise was desperate and short-lived. A partial amnesty for non-violent agitators, an increase in food rations, and promises of a new People's Dialogue Conference later that year. No one believed them. In the shadows, Fireline prepared for the next step. Colonel Kroll's Valkyrie Zwei network expanded. Plans for sabotaging border surveillance were drawn. An underground congress of resistance leaders from Leipzig, Jena, Dresden, Erfurt, and Magdeburg was called to assemble under one name, the Neue Republik Initiative. Not to reform the DDR, to replace it. And as the summer sun rose over Berlin, the wall no longer looked permanent. It looked vulnerable, not from outside, but from within. The world braced for what would come next. And what came next was fire. August 10th, 1970. The wall still stood, but its shadow no longer commanded silence. In Berlin, its surface bore fresh scars, slogans scrawled in defiance, patches chipped away by hidden hands in the night. What was once a monolith of fear had become a symbol of a state losing control. From the Alps to the Baltic, the socialist order trembled. Inside East Germany, the Neue Republik Initiative, NRI, formalized its structure. No longer a loose confederation of activists, it had become a shadow government. At its heart sat Jana Meyer, now fully in the open, no longer hiding behind Lena. Her voice had become the rallying cry of a fractured nation, and the footage she aired weeks earlier continued to circulate like contraband scripture. With her were men and women of various pasts, factory workers, students, NVA officers, defected Stasi analysts, and even disillusioned party bureaucrats. What united them was not ideology, but exhaustion. Exhaustion with fear, with hunger, with watching history pass by as their lives decayed behind concrete walls. The NRI began forming People's Defense Committees, lightly armed militias trained by defectors from the NVA and coordinated via encrypted radio networks. Their mission was not open warfare, but targeted disruption, blocking troop movements, cutting off supplies, seizing small towns where the Stasi had fled. The flashpoint came in Eisenach. The town had long been a symbol of East German resistance culture. Here, the NRI staged its boldest move yet, seizing control of the local administration building, broadcasting an open declaration of independence from the SED regime. Thousands rallied in the streets. The East German flag was torn down. In its place, a new banner flew, a black eagle with broken chains in its talons, the symbol of the Free German Confederation. SED Command, stunned and cornered, responded with unrestrained force. Soviet-backed special units of the Stasi, trained in counterinsurgency, launched Operation Stahlkralle, Iron Claw. Helicopters swept over Eisenach, dropping tear gas. Paratroopers moved in under cover of darkness. Buildings were set ablaze. Suspected sympathizers were dragged into trucks and disappeared. But this time, it was not a massacre in silence. This time, NATO satellites captured it all. Thermal imaging, real-time heat signatures, video relayed by intelligence drones launched from West German border installations, a secret program initiated weeks earlier under Operation Bastion. These images reached Washington, Paris, and London within hours. And for the first time, NATO debated intervention not as theory, but as necessity. In Brussels, the alliance met behind closed doors. The dilemma was grave. To act might mean war with the Soviet Union, but to remain silent would mean tacitly accepting Soviet military operations inside East Germany, in what NATO still officially considered an occupied zone, not a sovereign state. France urged caution. The United Kingdom pressed for covert support, not open conflict. But it was West Germany, represented by a pale and emotionally rattled Helmut Kohl, that made the most aggressive push. His words chilled the room. If Germany must remain divided, so be it. But we will not allow another Prague. We will not allow another Budapest. Not again. Not on our soil. NATO issued a formal warning to the Soviet Union. Any further military action against civilian populations in the German Democratic Republic would be considered a threat to European stability. The Kremlin responded with icy silence. Behind the curtain, Gorbachev was unraveling. He had staked his leadership on reforming the Soviet Union, not expanding its empire. But now, his reforms were failing, and his control over the military, the KGB, and the republics was slipping through his fingers. In July, protests in Latvia had turned violent. In Georgia, pro-independence militias openly defied Soviet forces. And on August 15th, the news broke. Ukraine's parliament had voted for a referendum on independence. Suddenly, Moscow had more to fear from within than from NATO. Faced with open rebellion in East Germany and collapse in the republics, Gorbachev held a final emergency Politburo meeting. His proposal? A phased withdrawal from the GDR, coupled with supervised elections. An attempt to salvage Soviet prestige while avoiding further bloodshed. But the hardliners had other plans. Within the bowels of the KGB's headquarters at Lubyanka, Chairman Vladimir Kryuchkov convened a security crisis group composed of senior generals and state security chiefs. They called Gorbachev's proposal capitulation. Their alternative? Operation Bratstvo. Brotherhood. Its objectives were chillingly simple. Seize Gorbachev's communications. Install a provisional emergency government. Re-establish order in the Warsaw Pact through decisive military force. East Germany would be the first test. If the operation succeeded there, it would prove Moscow still had teeth. If it failed, the Soviet Union itself might fracture beyond repair. And so the countdown began. Back in East Berlin, the resistance braced for a wave they could barely comprehend. Colonel Kroll and his network were tracking Soviet troop formations across Saxony and Brandenburg. Jana Meyer issued a call across free radio. This is no longer about the wall. It is about who we are and who we are willing to become. In West Berlin, NATO forces were placed on DEFCON 3. Fighter squadrons circled. Paratrooper battalions were redeployed to key checkpoints. One more incursion could trigger escalation, not just of a local conflict, but of global consequence. And in the midst of it all, average citizens, mothers, students, retirees, miners, built barricades with whatever they could find. They knew what was coming. The wall still stood. But what stood behind it, the fragile empire of lies, fear, and silence, was cracking like stained glass. The final hour was drawing near, and soon the storm would break. August 19th, 1990. The sun rose over Berlin through a veil of smoke. The world changed before breakfast. At 5 o'clock a.m. Moscow time, Soviet state television broadcast a startling announcement. President Mikhail Gorbachev had been placed on medical leave, and a new state committee for the emergency situation, the GKCHP, was now assuming control to preserve national stability. In reality, it was a coup. A quiet, steel-fisted seizure of the Kremlin, led by KGB Chief Vladimir Kryuchkov, Defense Minister Dmitry Yazov, and Interior Minister Boris Pugo. The junta wasted no time. Armored vehicles rolled through Moscow. Opposition newspapers were raided. The reformists were silenced. Radio signals were jammed. Gorbachev, trapped at his Crimean dacha, was cut off from the outside world. The Cold War, which had begun to thaw, now refroze with a vengeance. The new regime's first major act was to implement Directive 39B, the Firestorm Protocol, a contingency strategy for full-spectrum intervention in satellite states. East Germany, they declared, was under threat of Western-sponsored insurrection. All Soviet units stationed in the GDR were to prepare for active combat. At 7:12 a.m., the first shots were fired. Soviet airborne forces descended on the industrial city of Halle, long suspected of harboring resistance elements. NRI militia resisted fiercely, but were overmatched. Dozens were killed. The survivors melted into the forests. Simultaneously, a tank column pushed toward Leipzig again, this time to retake the city before it could join the Free German Confederation. But the people were waiting. Street barricades had been constructed from overturned cars and scaffolding. Tram lines were sabotaged. Fireline operatives had infiltrated key intersections. And most dangerously for the Soviets, NVA defectors now controlled the city's local defense garrison. What should have been a swift sweep turned into an urban quagmire. For the first time since World War II, Leipzig burned under Soviet artillery. The footage, once again, was undeniable. Satellite images confirmed urban combat. Western journalists stationed in West Berlin risked everything to sneak across the border, smuggling out interviews with wounded civilians and smuggled bullet casings. Within hours, the world saw the reality. The Soviet Union was not stabilizing East Germany. It was invading it. The global response was electric. In Washington, President Bush addressed the nation. "We stand today at a crossroads in history. The people of East Germany seek nothing more than the freedom we hold dear, and now face foreign guns in their own streets. We will not abandon them to tyranny." He stopped short of declaring military action, but NATO mobilized in full. DEFCON 2 was declared. American troops from the 82nd Airborne landed in Frankfurt. British Royal Marines were moved to border positions. French Mirage squadrons began combat air patrols over Bavaria. Chancellor Kohl, visibly shaken but resolute, issued what would become one of the most quoted lines of the era. "If they want to roll their tanks through our cities again, they will find we are not the same Germany they once occupied." Inside East Germany, chaos reigned. The wall, ironically, still stood, but it no longer divided a nation of order. It now cut through a country spiraling into civil war. In Dresden, firefights erupted between loyalist NVA units and defectors. In Erfurt, KGB black sites were overrun by civilian mobs. In the countryside, guerrilla cells ambushed convoys and fled into the Thuringian woods. The NRI, until now a resistance, had become an army in the shadows, and the most dangerous front was Berlin. The city became a flashpoint, the eye of a storm. Soviet troops controlled key infrastructure in the east. NATO held the west. But now, for the first time in decades, armed Germans, not proxies, not puppets, were fighting for their future in the no-man's land between. On August 20th, near Checkpoint Charlie, the unthinkable happened. A Soviet BMP, an infantry fighting vehicle, opened fire on what it claimed was an armed provocation. The shells landed just meters from the American sector. 2 U.S. soldiers were wounded. Radio intercepts showed the Soviet captain had acted without orders, panicked by false intelligence that NATO was advancing. But panic, in such a pamiasit, was deadly. Within minutes, American artillery crews went on alert. Air raid sirens howled in Berlin. West German forces scrambled to reinforce civilian shelters. The fear wasn't that war might begin, but that it already had. It took a full 10 hours of frantic back-channel communication, through the Swiss embassy, through the Red Cross, even through Vatican intermediaries, to prevent a NATO counterstrike. But the message was clear: one more shell, one more death, and the world could burn. And in Moscow, uncertainty ruled. The coup leaders had not expected resistance on this scale. They had not expected the West to react so swiftly. They had not expected East Germany to fight. By August 21st, Gorbachev's supporters in the Red Army, notably General Pavel Grachiev and Marshal Dmitry Volkogonov, began mobilizing loyalist divisions outside Moscow. A counter-coup was forming. Civil war in the Soviet Union now loomed as a possibility. And so, the question hanging over Berlin, over Bonn, over Brussels, was no longer, what if the wall never fell? It was something far more terrifying. What if the wall became the front line of World War III? August 23, 1990. For 3 days, the Soviet coup held the Kremlin in its iron grip. But cracks were spreading. Gorbachev, though silenced in his dacha in Crimea, was not forgotten. Reformist forces within the Red Army, quietly coordinated by Marshal Volkogonov and Major General Grachiev, began pushing west toward Moscow. They avoided direct confrontation, instead capturing communications hubs and gaining control of state TV transmitters outside the capital. By midday, broadcasts across Russia flickered with a pre-recorded message. Gorbachev, calm but visibly aged, speaking directly to the nation. "This is not the Soviet Union I promised you. This is not reform. It is regression. If we survive this crisis, we must never allow fear to lead us again." The message struck deep. Tens of thousands flooded the streets of Moscow, Leningrad, Tbilisi, and Kiev, demanding the resignation of the State Committee. In Red Square, crowds linked arms around government buildings. Tanks sent to suppress the protests refused to fire. Some even turned their barrels skyward. The coup was crumbling from within. Inside East Germany, the news spread like wildfire. Resistance morale soared. In Leipzig, the NRI declared the city free territory. Colonel Kroll, once a silent conspirator, emerged publicly at a massive rally in the city's ruined main square, flanked by militia members and defected officers. He raised his fist and proclaimed, "We are not NATO's soldiers. We are not Moscow's pawns. We are Germans, and we are taking back our future." For the first time, the Neue Republik initiative was recognized, not just as a movement, but as a provisional government. Local councils in Dresden, Erfurt, Magdeburg, and Rostock pledged allegiance. Even in East Berlin, isolated units of the NVA began defecting. The SED regime, still nominally in control of East Berlin's inner core, issued furious declarations of treason and Western subversion. But their voice was hollow. Their support base had eroded. Marcus Wolf, realizing the Stasi's days were numbered, vanished from public view, rumored to have escaped to Moscow, though no evidence surfaced. Meanwhile, Jana Meyer, still recovering from a minor shrapnel injury sustained during a firefight near Potsdam, broadcast a message that would become iconic. "The wall may stand in concrete, but it has fallen in spirit. Let them fire their shells. Let them march their armies. They cannot kill an idea whose time has come." In the West, NATO's posture shifted. With the Soviet coup losing control and the resistance gaining ground, President Bush and Chancellor Kohl began preparing for a post-DDR future. Bonn released a statement declaring it was prepared to recognize a free East German Republic, provided that 1. Democratic elections be held within 90 days. 2. Soviet troops begin an immediate phased withdrawal. 3. NATO forces refrain from entering East German territory unless invited by a democratically elected government. The message was calibrated, hopeful but firm. The Cold War was not over, but the door was opening. In Warsaw, the Polish government took a decisive step. It formally withdrew from the Warsaw Pact. The move sent shockwaves through the bloc. Hungary followed within days. Romania, led by its erratic and embattled dictator Nicolae Ceausescu, tried to declare neutrality, but his days were clearly numbered. The pact was dying, not by war, but by desertion. Soviet generals, increasingly isolated, began to demand that Khrushchev and his junta step down. On August 24th, one final confrontation occurred outside the Kremlin. Reformist forces, supported by popular uprisings in the capital, stormed key buildings. After a tense standoff, the junta surrendered without bloodshed. By nightfall, Gorbachev returned to Moscow. But he was not the same man. The events had broken something inside him. He delivered a speech that was more funeral than victory. The Soviet Union cannot be saved by force. It may not be saved at all. He ordered the immediate withdrawal of Soviet forces from East Germany. Quietly, he told his advisors that the USSR would allow its republics to decide their own paths. East Germany, once a frozen artifact of Cold War division, was now the first domino in a chain reaction that would tear down empires. But the price was not yet fully paid. Even as Soviet tanks began pulling back from Leipzig and Magdeburg, small skirmishes continued. Not all units obeyed withdrawal orders. Isolated firefights erupted as loyalist factions tried to sabotage retreat. One such incident, near the town of Wittenberg, saw the deaths of 13 civilians caught in crossfire between Soviet deserters and retreating VDV paratroopers. The NRI declared a week of mourning. Jana Meyer visited the site days later, where she gave a eulogy for the fallen. Standing before a burned-out school building, she said, "Freedom does not arrive in parades. It is born in pain. Let us not forget the cost. In West Berlin, the wall still stood. But it was no longer defended. Graffiti covered every inch. Some painted flowers, Some painted slogans, others just names, names of the lost. But then, on the morning of August 28th, something changed. A single Volkspolizei truck, abandoned, sat unmanned at the Brandenburg Gate. Teenagers approached it cautiously. No shots rang out. Word spread. By noon, a crowd had gathered. By evening, thousands, not to protest, but to witness. And as the sun set, a young man climbed to the top of the wall, held out his hand, and pulled a girl up beside him, east and west, together. The wall still stood, but no one guarded it. And that night, hammers rang once again. This time, no one stopped them. But peace, real peace, was still fragile. And not everyone was ready to let go of the past. September 1st, 1990. Across Germany, the bells tolled, some in mourning, others in celebration. The Berlin Wall still cast its shadow, but now only in symbolism. It was no longer a fortress. It had become a ruin, a stage where history had played its cruelest act, and now, perhaps, its most uncertain. In Bonn, Chancellor Helmut Kohl sat in his office, flanked by aides, intelligence analysts, and foreign policy advisors. On the polished desk before him lay two draft proposals, one from the Neue Republik Initiative, now calling itself the Provisional East German Congress, and one from the French and British delegations, demanding a stabilization period before any discussions of reunification. Kohl's dream had always been clear: a single, democratic, peaceful Germany. But now, with Soviet forces in retreat, the Warsaw Pact in shambles, and East Germany still reeling from urban conflict, the path forward was perilous. The East was not ready. In Leipzig, Jana Meyer now chaired the Provisional Congress, a diverse coalition of NRI figures, former SED defectors, civic leaders, and trade unionists. Her health had suffered, but her voice remained unshaken. Still, she faced criticism from all sides. The moderates urged immediate negotiation with Bonn for a fast-track reunification. The radicals feared absorption, that the West would drown them in capitalism, strip their dignity, and erase the revolution's spirit. The working poor, who had risked everything for change, worried that they would be forgotten in a new united Germany dominated by Western wealth and Western rules. Meanwhile, in the countryside, paramilitary violence still flared. Rogue Stasi loyalists, remnants of Wolf's shattered intelligence network, launched a series of bombings in September. One attack struck a train station in Cottbus, killing 14. Another targeted a field hospital near Weimar. Though the SED was gone as a political force, its embers remained dangerous. The Fireline's militias were now charged with rooting out these insurgents. But as militias took control of security, tensions rose. Civilians feared trading one authoritarianism for another. Amnesty International, the UN, and the Red Cross called for international monitors. And for the first time since the 1950s, a United Nations peacekeeping mission was authorized to deploy within East Germany, not as occupiers, but as observers. Meanwhile, Soviet troops, under Gorbachev's withdrawal order, began dismantling bases. Long columns of tanks and transport trucks rolled eastward. But as they passed through broken towns and cheering crowds, many soldiers left quietly behind. Defectors, deserters, or simply men who refused to return to a crumbling empire. In Moscow, Gorbachev limped through what was left of his presidency. The coup had shattered his credibility. The Baltic states now openly declared independence. Ukraine's referendum loomed. The USSR, as it had existed for 7 decades, was disintegrating, not in fire, but in a slow, inevitable collapse. By mid-September, Kohl and Meyer met in person for the first time. The summit took place in Erfurt, in the ruins of an old Lutheran seminary turned makeshift government hall. Security was tight. International press swarmed the perimeter, but inside, the mood was strangely warm. Kohl, ever the pragmatist, spoke softly but clearly. "We want one Germany, but not at the expense of justice. You fought for this country's soul. You must help shape what it becomes. Meyer was more direct. We will not trade one master for another. The East must rise with dignity, or it will rise in anger again. Their meeting yielded an agreement, the Erfurt Accord. Under it, both German states would prepare for reunification talks, but only after a 12-month transition period. During this phase, the Provisional Congress would form a transitional parliament in East Germany. Free elections would be held in both states. Economic and infrastructure aid from West Germany and the European community would flow into the East, but under joint administration with local councils. Former SED and Stasi officials would be barred from holding office until reviewed by a truth commission, modeled after the early proposals for South Africa's transitional justice process. The accord was met with cautious optimism. Western markets soared. In Berlin, people began painting murals over the wall. Not just symbols of protest, but visions of the future. Children reaching across cracks, broken chains reshaped into bridges, a new map of Germany, whole again. But not everyone was satisfied. In Bavaria, conservative voices warned that Bonn was buying a broken state. Some within NATO feared that a newly unified Germany might pursue neutrality or drift from the alliance. In Washington, Bush's re-election campaign weighed whether full support for German unification might alienate anti-Soviet hardliners who feared another Versailles in reverse. And in Russia, the far-right and ultra-nationalists accused Gorbachev of betraying Berlin, calling for his resignation and the restoration of Soviet pride by force. Among them, a new figure began gaining notoriety, Vladimir Zhirinovsky, whose calls for restoring Slavic dominance in Eastern Europe found growing support in military circles. Inside East Germany, the peace was uneasy. A rogue military unit, the 9th Motor Rifle Division, refused to disband. Stationed near the Polish border, it declared the Provisional Congress illegitimate and began fortifying its position. Some suspected backing from Soviet hardliners who had escaped justice in Moscow. The NRI leadership faced a terrible choice: confront them and risk open conflict again, or allow a lawless enclave to fester. In the end, it was the Firelines militia, under Kroll's command, that led a midnight raid on the base, seizing it in 12 minutes. It was swift, bloody, and final. The militia burned the old SED flags they found in the armory. Among the captured documents were detailed plans for sabotage and assassination. One target, Jana Meyer. From that day forward, she moved under constant protection. But her resolve never wavered. As September ended, she addressed a crowd of 30,000 in Berlin, standing atop a crumbling section of the wall. Her words echoed across the city. We are not just tearing down walls of stone. We are tearing down the walls in our minds, between East and West, between the powerful and the forgotten, between the future and the fear of becoming it. That night, candles were lit across Germany, not just for the fallen, but for what might still be built. But far beyond Berlin, storms still gathered. In Moscow, in Belgrade, in Baghdad. And Germany's fragile peace would soon be tested by a world that refused to stop turning. October 3rd, 1980. It should have been the day of reunification, Tag der Deutschen Einheit, the day of German unity. In our world, the flags flew. Crowds sang. Fireworks bloomed across Berlin as East and West Germany formally became one nation again. But in this timeline, the wall never fell, not as a sudden collapse, but as a prolonged war of attrition. There was no parade, only silence, scattered candlelight, and a cautious hope pulsing beneath the surface. Germany remained divided, if not by force, then by time. Instead of unity, this date became a symbol of transition, a national day of mourning and recommitment. In Leipzig, hundreds gathered outside the Provisional Congress to lay wreaths for the victims of the Halle bombardment and the Wittenberg massacre. In West Berlin, choirs sang Beethoven's Ode to Joy beneath the shadow of the wall, now half demolished by hand. But beyond Germany, the world was no longer waiting. The collapse of Soviet control over East Germany had ignited something vast and irreversible. The Warsaw Pact, once an unshakable block of iron, was now a carcass. Poland, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia raced toward NATO-friendly reforms. Bulgaria purged its party elite in a wave of populist protests. Even Romania's iron-fisted regime finally cracked. In December 1990, Nicolae Ceausescu was overthrown in a bloody revolt. The execution, this time, was not by firing squad in a snowy courtyard, but by a military tribunal broadcast live across Bucharest. Crowds flooded the streets with candles and chants. A statue of Lenin was torn down and replaced with the Romanian flag. By year's end, the Warsaw Pact had formally dissolved. And with it came questions NATO had long feared to ask. Would Germany, once unified, demand the withdrawal of all foreign troops, American and Russian alike? Would it remain within NATO or seek neutrality? And perhaps most urgently, would Germany assert economic dominance over Eastern Europe, reshaping the map of influence through money instead of missiles? In Washington, President Bush convened a high-level summit. His advisors were split. Some argued for deeper ties, rapid investment in East Germany to stabilize the region, lock in allegiance, and demonstrate the success of democratic capitalism. Others warned of overreach. The U.S. was entering a recession. The Gulf was boiling, and Germany, now emerging as the heart of Europe, might become a competitor rather than a partner. Across the Atlantic, France and Britain grew uneasy. President François Mitterrand feared a Fourth Reich, not by military conquest, but through financial absorption. Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, facing waning popularity at home, warned that a hasty reunification could destabilize all of Western Europe. "We may have survived the wall," she told Parliament, "but we must be careful not to invite new walls, economic, cultural, political, by pretending this fragile moment is already resolved." Meanwhile, the Soviet Union was imploding. In Kiev, the Ukrainian independence referendum passed with a staggering 88% vote in favor. Belarus, Armenia, Kazakhstan followed. Gorbachev, his power hollowed by the failed coup and political isolation, resigned in December. The red flag was lowered from the Kremlin for the last time. In his farewell speech, he said only this: "We tried to preserve a union of people, but in the end, only walls remained, and even those we could not hold." With Gorbachev gone, the Russian Federation emerged under the uneasy leadership of Boris Yeltsin. His first international move was bold and unexpected, recognizing the Provisional Congress of East Germany as the legitimate transitional authority. This put him at odds with former Soviet generals, now scattered across Russia, Ukraine, and Central Asia. Many still considered East Germany part of the former strategic frontier. Some were even suspected of supplying rogue elements still active in rural Saxony, sabotaging infrastructure and harassing resistance workers. Inside East Germany, reconstruction began in earnest. But rebuilding a nation gutted by repression, war, and neglect was not easy. Electricity remained unstable outside major cities. Unemployment soared as former state-run industries collapsed. West German consultants arrived, some with good intentions, others with patronizing arrogance. Cultural clashes grew. Capitalism, suddenly introduced, was not universally welcomed. In Dresden, resistance leaders demanded price controls to avoid mass starvation. In Magdeburg, old men who once believed in socialism as a noble dream now begged for medicine priced in West German marks. Jana Meyer, now visibly aged from stress and injury, struggled to keep her coalition together. Every meeting of the Provisional Congress felt like a minefield. Centrists demanded faster integration. Radicals warned against West German colonization. Some called for keeping a separate currency. Others proposed merging fully under the basic law of West Germany. The tipping point came in Berlin. On November 9th, the anniversary of the night the wall should have fallen, tens of thousands gathered in what was once the death strip. There, before the half-demolished barrier, a surprise guest appeared: Chancellor Helmut Kohl. Without fanfare or military escort, he walked through the ruins of the wall, accompanied only by a translator and a single bodyguard. The crowd parted. Some applauded. Others wept. He took the microphone from a rusted stand and said, "I have not come to lecture, I have come to listen. This wall stood for division, for pain. But now, let it stand, as a memory of what we overcame, not just between states, but between people." He extended his hand toward Meyer, who stepped onto the platform. The image, captured by hundreds of cameras, would become the defining symbol of this alternate German transition. Not a fall, not a surrender, but a handshake above ruins. That night, the last section of the wall was brought down by the people. No order, no permission, just hands, hammers, and memory. It was not yet unity, but it was something greater than silence. Yet even as the crowd sang, far to the east, new maps were being drawn in Moscow and Belgrade. Because while Germany was healing, others were preparing for war. January 1991. A bitter wind swept across Berlin, chilling the newly rebuilt courtyards of the former Stasi headquarters, now repurposed into a transitional justice archive. There were no parades, only long lines of survivors filing into public hearings, testifying to decades of surveillance, torture, betrayal. Truth, it seemed, was as heavy as war, and far slower. The Provisional Congress continued to govern East Germany, barely. Elections were scheduled for June, but the coalition was fragile. Economic aid from the West flowed steadily, but it wasn't enough. Infrastructure was crumbling. Rural unemployment hit 35%. Nationalists in the East warned that reunification would reduce them to a forgotten province. In Dresden, violent protests broke out between pro-unity youth groups and older workers who believed their factories had been sacrificed to Western greed. Meanwhile, the West had its own fears. Germany's rise was too fast, too uncertain. London and Paris quietly pressured Bonn to delay constitutional integration. European leaders feared a newly unified Germany might dominate the continent again, economically, if not militarily. Already, German banks were buying up assets in Prague, Budapest, and Sofia, but even as Germany wrestled with its identity, the world's attention shifted south, to Yugoslavia. In this reality, the prolonged survival of the Berlin Wall had a profound domino effect. The Soviet Union's delayed collapse bought time for nationalist forces elsewhere to arm, entrench, and prepare. In Belgrade, Slobodan Milosevic, emboldened by the East German bloodshed and the West's initial hesitance, launched a political campaign for a unified Serb homeland. Croatia, Slovenia, and Bosnia each declared that they would leave the Yugoslav Federation. But unlike in our world, this time, the dissolution began as a preemptive war. On March 3, 1991, Yugoslav People's Army, JNA units, launched surprise operations in Slovenia and northern Croatia. Entire towns were shelled. Ethnic cleansing began almost immediately. The West was caught flat-footed. NATO, still focused on Germany's transition and the instability in post-Soviet Russia, failed to respond in time. But one nation watched with growing alarm: the new East Germany. Jana Meyer, no longer chair of the Congress, but still its moral compass, addressed the situation in a televised speech from Leipzig. "We know what it is to be ignored. We know what it is to wait for freedom while cities burn. Germany must not be silent." Her plea resonated deeply. Thousands of East Germans volunteered to send humanitarian convoys south. Medical supplies, engineers, and even unofficial militia units began quietly crossing into Slovenia, a trickle that would soon become a stream. In Bonn, the West German parliament was split. Some lawmakers argued that intervention would threaten NATO unity. Others, especially from the newly integrated eastern districts, demanded action. Helmut Kohl, ever the strategist, sought a middle path. Germany would not send troops, but it would send recognition. On March 28, 1991, Germany became the first European power to formally recognize Slovenian and Croatian independence. The reaction in Belgrade was explosive. Milosevic declared Germany an enemy of the Slavic world. Serbian militias began targeting ethnic German communities in Vojvodina, accusing them of spying and sabotage. The ghosts of World War II long buried but never forgotten, returned with terrifying speed. Then came the turning point. In April 1991, a German Red Cross convoy was ambushed near Osijek. 15 volunteers were killed, including 2 East German doctors who had once served during the Leipzig uprisings. The footage, aired worldwide, shocked the conscience of Europe. That night, protests erupted in Berlin, Munich, Leipzig, and Hamburg. The people, East and West alike, demanded action. But what kind? Militarily, Germany was still divided. The Bundeswehr had integrated some former NVA units, but command structures were shaky. NATO discouraged any unilateral intervention. The wounds of the Cold War had not yet healed enough for a German army to march again, even in defense of others. But symbolically, Germany acted. Jana Meyer led a delegation, not as a government official, but as a human rights envoy, into Zagreb. She met with Croatian leaders, visited refugee camps, and delivered a speech at the UN outpost there. If we do not act when villages burn, then all the walls we've torn down were built again in our hearts. Her speech moved the world. It also infuriated Belgrade. Serbian state media denounced her as a Nazi puppet. A bounty was placed on her head by a paramilitary group known as the White Wolves. Back home, Meyer's influence only grew. In May, her political movement, the Verenigd Morgen, United Tomorrow coalition, swept municipal elections across the East. The message was clear. East Germany might have survived occupation, repression, and civil war, but it would not become passive. It would lead, morally, if not militarily. In June, the first truly free, unified elections in modern German history were held. Turnout, 91%. Jana Meyer, Helmut Kohl, and a handful of new leaders, from both East and West, stood on stage at the Bundestag in Berlin, now rebuilt in glass and steel, symbolizing transparency. A new constitution was ratified, incorporating both the West's liberal democratic principles and the East's hard-won protections for workers, housing, and truth commissions. Germany was whole again. But the cost was clear. 472 civilians had died in the East German conflict. Tens of thousands were displaced. The psychological scars would last generations. And yet, as Balkan cities burned and post-Soviet republics wrestled with identity, Germany had become something rare, a nation reborn not in triumph, but in humility. But before it could breathe, the world shifted again. August 1991. Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait. As Western powers scrambled toward the Gulf, one question hung over NATO and over Germany. Would the new republic follow or finally lead? October 3, 1991. Exactly 1 year after the day that should have marked Germany's reunification, the country finally stood together, not as victors, not as conquerors, but as survivors of their own shattered past. In Berlin, the final panels of the wall had been removed, not demolished by machines, but disassembled by hand, piece by piece. Some sections were preserved in museums, others were sent abroad, gifts to foreign embassies, memorials, silent warnings carved in concrete. What remained was memory and the burden of deciding what came next. Germany was officially one republic now, the Vereinigte Bundesrepublik, a unified state with a revised constitution. It enshrined not just democracy and free markets, but also rights rooted in the East's struggle, protections for housing, healthcare, worker representation, and most controversially, a national memorial registry of political prisoners and disappeared persons to ensure their stories would never vanish again. But unity was not harmony. In Frankfurt and Dresden, protests flared over the slow pace of integration. In Munich, business leaders accused the government of catering too much to Eastern welfare demands. In the East, resentment brewed against the rapid privatization of state industries, which saw thousands lose their jobs to Western corporations. Some called it economic annexation. And yet, despite all this, the Republic held. In the Bundestag, East and West sat side by side. Jana Meyer, now a federal minister without portfolio, a special role created for her at public demand, focused on transitional justice and foreign diplomacy. Helmut Kohl, still chancellor, aged and weary, had already announced he would not seek another term. The world, meanwhile, had moved on, rapidly, dangerously. In the Gulf, Operation Desert Storm loomed. U.S. and coalition forces massed in Saudi Arabia to prepare for the liberation of Kuwait. The question came swiftly to Berlin. Would the new Germany participate? Public sentiment was divided. West German conservatives supported a limited deployment of logistics and medical aid. Many East Germans, scarred by years of militarization and foreign occupation, flatly rejected involvement. The idea of sending young Germans back into combat, even in a multilateral operation, reignited old fears. But Jana Meyer saw a different path. She addressed the Bundestag in a historic speech. "We do not owe the world our weapons. We owe it our witness. We were divided by war, reunited by struggle. Let Germany show another way, by leading in peace, not in fire." Germany did not send troops to Iraq. Instead, it launched one of the largest humanitarian deployments in its history. Mobile hospitals, civilian engineers, refugee infrastructure, and financial support to the UN mission. It was not the path of least resistance, but it was the path Germany chose, shaped by its past, defined by its scars. And the world noticed. Across Eastern Europe, former satellite states looked to Berlin not with fear but with curiosity. Poland signed bilateral trade and educational agreements. Hungary requested German advisors to help rebuild its public institutions. Even Russia, now led by the unpredictable Boris Yeltsin, maintained diplomatic warmth, recognizing Berlin's role in avoiding a wider conflict during the 1989 coup. Back home, something unexpected happened. In early 1992, a group of Berlin teenagers, born in the shadow of the wall, launched a street art movement called Wiedersehen, or To See Again. They painted over surviving bunkers, old Stasi towers, and military checkpoints with faces. Thousands of them, stylized portraits of ordinary Germans, East and West, young and old, smiling, weeping, defiant. They weren't trying to erase the past. They were trying to humanize it. And in a way, that's what Germany had become, a place where memory was not a weapon, but a tool. In Leipzig, the old fire-damaged square where the resistance once stood had been rebuilt, not with statues, but with open-air benches and a circle of stone markers, each engraved with a name of someone who vanished, someone who fought, someone who returned. And among them, one inscription read simply, "For the girl who typed by candlelight and spoke to the world." Jana never asked for that. She continued working until her health failed in '99, passing away quietly in her garden in Brandenburg. Her funeral drew crowds from both sides of the former divide, and from as far away as Moscow, Washington, and Sarajevo. She had become something greater than a revolutionary. She had become a bridge. So what if the Berlin Wall had never fallen? We would have lost the miracle moment. That one night in 1989, when history shifted on confusion and courage. But in this alternate world, the wall was torn down, not by policy, not by accident, but by people who chose to stand, to suffer, and to survive. And what emerged was not a perfect Germany, not even a happy one, but a real one that earned its unity through fire, truth, and the choice not to repeat its darkest chapters. A nation without a wall. What do you think would have happened if this alternate world became reality? Would it have made our world better or worse? Let us know your thoughts in the comments, and if you found this journey fascinating, don't forget to like and share the video.